Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by folks who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Joris Mercelis is assistant professor at University of Johns Hopkins. Joris, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you're researching and writing about?
Yes, my research at Hagley was about a project I'm working on, a book project on the history of the photographic industry and photographic science and technology. And the project specifically focuses on Eastman Kodak Company, so the large multinational headquartered in Rochester in Upper New York. And I'm interested in how Kodak, which really dominated the photographic industry for most of the 20th century, like how that translated or didn't translate into scientific and technological influence as well. Because not many people might be aware of this, but Kodak also had a global network of photographic research labs established in the first half of the 20th century. So they didn't just have like large research labs in Rochester, which were the world's largest labs focused on photography, kind of anywhere in the world. But they also had labs in Britain, France, camera development facilities in Germany, a lab in Australia, a lab in Panama in Central America. So it's a pretty large network. And I'm looking at these labs in part to not only understand the work that Kodak itself was doing, but also to understand like its interactions with company outsiders, with scientists outside of Kodak, with scientific institutions, professional organizations. And I want to understand to what extent these outsiders also like depended on Kodak, like to what extent Kodak really was or wasn't able to translate its dominance of the photographic industry into scientific and technological control and influence.
That sounds like quite an interesting project right at the intersection of business history and the history of science.
Exactly, that's where I see it. So yeah, it's I'm based at a history of science and technology departments, but I'm also very much interested in business history or history of capitalism. And yeah, I'm trying to 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 draw on kind of insights and like methods from both of these fields.
I wonder which set of motivations was driving the Kodak company's decision to build this network of research laboratories. Was it primarily business? Was it primarily profit driven? Or was it primarily, obviously it's a mix of both, but also influenced by the desire to push sound scientific boundaries, the boundaries of knowledge and technique farther?
That's a great question. I think both of those things are related because from the very beginning, if you think about like why the research labs in Rochester were being established, one of the reasons was that George Eastman, the Kodak's founder, was concerned that an outsider might come up with like a commercially successful color photography process, and that was like the biggest threat he could think of to Kodak's dominance because there's this long interest in coming up with like a large scale commercially viable color photography process, and that's partly a scientific problem as well, right? Like you want to understand like color photography as a technology and research that's relevant to that field. So that's like one example to illustrate how both of these things were very much interconnected. But when it comes specifically to understanding why these international labs were created, my research shows that it was very much an extension of Kodak's investments in manufacturing outside of the United States. Because it's not easy to produce photographic film or to produce photographic paper or like some of the other technologies they were making. There's a lot of things that could go wrong. So it's very important to have some kind of local troubleshooting capabilities, but not just that. It's also important to be able to make like local adjustments based on, for instance, operating in different environmental conditions, like things like humidity, maybe pollution, say like if like your the composition of your water that you need to as part of like your manufacturing process slightly different, that might affect the process. So it's very hard to really completely standardize the production of these products. So it was a little bit different in each of these sites, and it was really helpful from the company's perspective to have like local research and development capabilities to kind of make these adjustments and to engage in these kind of problem solving work. Of course, they also did more than that. It wasn't only like problem solving. At some point, they also do like more fundamental research, and they also try to benefit from, for instance, being able to hire scientists who are trained at a different kind of institution than are scientists in the United States, and they might bring a different kind of perspective on some of the problems that were of interest to them or that might have connections with other universities, etc. But certainly in the beginning, much of it is really closely linked to their manufacturing activities. The main exception to this pattern is the lab in Panama, because that's of all of these international labs established in the first half of the 20th century, that's the only one that's not really connected to like local or regional factories of Kodak. It's really established as more of an outpost of their research labs in Rochester. And it works on problems that are also of much interest to the military. So in that case, the connection with the US military was more important than the connection with Kodak's own kind of like local production facilities, etc.
Well, why disperse production, the manufacturing process internationally in that way?
Yeah, I guess that's the next question, right? Like if it's linked to manufacturing, why not concentrate manufacturing in the United States? And there's different reasons for that. Like in the Australian case, for example, it's partly a story about tariffs and about that made it more expensive to just continue to just export to the Australian markets. In other cases, it's just because Kodak had this opportunity to acquire a company that already existed. So they're essentially taking over the factory of a company that's already around, like they did a merger with Pathé and in France, which was like a major local photographic cinematographic company. In Germany as well, they acquired a local camera manufacturer because they felt that that would straighten their kind of presence in the German or more broadly European market. So it's kind of a mix of different considerations. And at the beginning, they weren't necessarily thinking about R&D as like the main consideration, but it's kind of as a consequence, as a corollary of those manufacturing investments that end up establishing these research labs as well.
Did these laboratories take directions from Rochester, or were they able to set their own research agendas?
That's a great question. So they had to report to Rochester, like their directors had to report, and some of the like scientists as well. So sometimes like Rochester would review some of their like publications to see like whether all of it could be published or certain things were like considered too sensitive or like proprietary. But up to about the 1970s, there was a great deal of autonomy, and it's really not until like the last decades of the 20th century when you can start to see like real efforts to like more strongly integrate and coordinate all of the work that's being done, like for instance, within the European context, where they established more of a Europe-wide kind of organization that would kind of monitor like what was happening in different labs, and also globally. So yeah, but prior to that time, while there is certainly collaboration happening, certainly between Britain and France, there still was a great deal of autonomy as well, and I think that's something that was really appreciated by the scientists based in Europe, for example. Sometimes they even wanted to. They felt even a bit neglected in some cases. That's for instance in the Australian case, they were like we really would love to work more closely with you, is what they're saying, but it was just like in that case, there's obviously like the geographical distance. It's like one. big complication to establish like more closer to establish a closer cooperation.
Well, what were some of the research problems that these laboratories were tackling in this period?
Right. There's a lot of different questions that photographic researchers, photographic scientists were interested in, and some of them uh, like remained like very much the same problems throughout like almost like a century, but they're approaching them through different frameworks. Like some of the basic question would be like what's really going on scientifically when this latent image appears on this photographic plate, or how should we really understand process of photographic development, or how should measure or standardize the sensitivity of different kinds of materials. So those are some of the basic problems in photographic science. But in my project, I'm also interested in like areas of research that were meant for specific applications of photography in the sciences, and astronomy and astrophysics is like one specific example. So you had like a team of researchers in the Kodak lab in Rochester who were trying to make new kinds of photographic plates that would especially meet like some very specific needs of astronomers at like Mount Wilson in California, for example, and also at other labs. So those are the kind of examples that interest me, especially because they allow me to understand these relationships and collaborations with outside scientists as well.
Yeah, that's really fascinating the way that scientific research in one area can drive and inform new discoveries in completely unrelated areas of knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, photography, it's also this kind of research technology, and it's used
Yeah.
in so many different areas of science, in like physical sciences, but also very much in the life sciences. In medicine, of course, feels like X-ray imaging becomes an important market for Kodak and also for other companies uh, in the fields. And one of the questions that interests me there is also like what kind of applications Kodak was willing to support, in the sense of like actually letting a team of their own researchers work on making technology more suitable for like some very specific purpose, even though financially, for example, there might not be that much money to be made. For instance, if you think about like astronomy once again, like for Kodak, they did not really anticipate really like making a lot of money by selling these, or providing these astronomers with these plates, but they're nevertheless willing to invest kind of resources, manpower into doing this research. And that's something that interests me. Like, why were they willing to do that? Even though clearly it's not just about like making money. There's like other considerations at stake in examples like this one.
Well, I know you're still working on the project, so your findings might be tentative, but could you hazard an answer to that question? Why would a company like Kodak invest in, for example, providing specialized equipment to astronomers, even though they don't represent a major market or profit opportunity?
Yeah, so in that particular case, I think it's partly a question of scientific prestige is one relevant consideration. Like astronomy was one of the most highly regarded, kind of most prestigious areas of science, and Kodak was getting a lot of public credits for the services they were providing from like astronomers, but also like in general media. So this is something that was kind of good PR for them to be helping this work. But it was also connected to some of their own research. So they felt that by studying these specific problems astronomers had, or like the problems involved in making these very specific like emulsions plates that astronomers needed, which were like more sensitive to specific areas of the spectrum, that this would also be just for them a way to learn more about like some basic mechanisms in photography that might also be valuable for them for their like other projects, like other areas of their research. So they also felt that in this example, there's like interconnections with some of their own core interests central to their own business, especially like learning about like photographic like emulsions and things like that.
Hmm.
But the story is a bit different for different applications, like X-ray imaging, for instance, is like a is like a larger and lucrative market. Like in at Hagley, I was also looking at DuPont, which was also active in this field, and you can really see that they're willing to invest a lot of money in like advertising for their like X-ray medical film um, and for instance, like being present at like an international conference of radiologists and in Italy and providing them with like travel guidebook for like Italy as a way of kind of gaining their favor. So those markets in those cases there are significant amounts of money at stake. But in other cases, it's more about like other factors are more important, I would argue, or at least or the financial interests are of more of an indirect nature because they feel like there might be technological benefits that might, you know, result in financial gains as well, but not directly related to, not directly in one field of astronomy, like astrophysics in this particular example.
Well, I'm glad that you've mentioned Hagley because you've recently completed your NEH Hagley postdoctoral fellowship, and I'd like to know how it was, how perhaps it contributed to your professional development in this stage of your career, and also what materials you were able to look at while you were at Hagley.
Yeah, Hackney was a great place to be for me. And I think as with many other like of your researchers, I think DuPont is part of the answer because I don't think there's not that many people might associate DuPont with photography, but DuPont was actually one of the main competitors of Kodak in the United States in for instance in producing movie picture film and also in the like medical like X-ray market. So the fact that Hagley has all of these DuPont records allowed me to also look at Kodak through the lens of like one of its main competitors, at least in the US context. And that offered some very interesting perspective on exactly this question of like Kodak's market dominance and how it was or wasn't able to translate that into scientific influence because a company like DuPont, they were interested in taking on Kodak in kind of the large amateur photography markets, but they kind of had to conclude that Kodak was just too strong in that general market. Like they had like a really strong brands. They had like very complete product lines that were kind of interconnected with each other. And there's a range of different reasons like why it's really hard, even for like a large and wealthy company like DuPont to take on Kodak in this kind of main, like most profitable photographic markets. But they were able to be quite successful in more niche markets where they could benefit from like specific technical expertise. In case of DuPont, things like polyester, and in those markets, you can see that there's kind of different dynamics at play in these smaller, like more niche markets. There were like one of the things that's really important is to really like get to know like your customers and their specific needs. And your like the example of radiologists could come up again, like to really understand this community, like how they're like what they like about the different products that are available, etc. And in these smaller markets and more, in many cases, like more kind of science-oriented markets, technical markets, some of these strengths that Kodak had in other fields didn't really apply, or at least not to the same extent. So in those, if you look at the dynamics in those smaller markets, there's yeah, in general, there's like more competition, and Kodak is not always as successful in really controlling or establishing like a strong scientific influence. And there's some striking examples in the archives. Like one ad I was like one source I was really excited about was a Kodak ad in Scientific American. It was part of the records of DuPont's photo products departments. And like one of their like advertising professionals like added a notes to the ad kind of stating like this is like another example of kind of Kodak probing for some mutual interest and maybe some profits from like by like finding like scientists interested in your products. But it also kind of highlighted that it's really it's not easy to kind of they're kind of hoping that the products they're describing might be of use, to scientists, but they themselves didn't really seem sure that that would be the case. And it's partly because these needs were so heterogeneous. So you really need to have like a good insight in like a specific fields, like what is it that those scientists, those engineers and others are really looking for when they're in terms of like their photographic needs.
Well, that seems like your NEH Hagley postdoc was really useful for you then.
Yeah. So yes, there's the like those DuPont connection I was talking about, but there's also a lot of other uh, sources at Hagley. Like there's some more like trade journals and more technical publications were like turned out to be really useful for my work. There's a journal called Industrial Photography, for example, that really gives a good overview of like what are the main like what are some of the newer markets for photography in like science and medicine. For instance, like what are the needs, photographic needs associated with the space race or with underwater photography in the late 1960s, when there's a lot of interest in oceanography linked to the funding from the Office of Naval Research and kind of the interests military needs of the Navy. So in these kind of applications, you can really get a sense of like how the field evolves and like which companies are trying to are kind of entering these kind of small, like more technical markets, and to what extent Kodak is kind of dominant in this field. So yeah, there's a lot of great material. So yeah, I would say it was like a very productive state.
Terrific. Well, I can't discuss this subject of Kodak and technology and research without asking, how did Kodak have its lunch eaten when it came to digital photography, given that it had invested so much in building out this sophisticated and rather agile, at least it seems to me, rather agile research apparatus? How did they get beaten so badly to the digital photography space?
Right, that's the big question, right? That many people have tried to answer. And one of the contributions I tried to make in my project is actually to shift attention a bit away from that question, in the sense that I would argue that it's at least as remarkable that a company can be so dominant for like about a century and is able to like maintain its influence, compared with the fact that, of course, it also then there's this dramatic decline that indeed happens afterwards. And it is interesting because Kodak really was a leader, certainly within the more like traditional photographic companies. Kodak really was a leader in terms of diversifying its its research into electronic imaging. It was famously was early to invent like a digital camera. It invested in fields like solid state physics, which are very relevant for understanding digital photography. But it was in a really difficult position to balance that with the fact that film was its most profitable product, and it was still selling very well in like the 70s, 80s, even though there's some more competition from companies like Fuji in Japan. So it was like a very difficult balancing act for them. To what extent should they still prioritize their like more like traditional business, or to what extent should they prioritize these newer markets? And they try a range of different strategies, and ultimately failed to really successfully make this transition. But in a way, it's also I think history has kind of shown that there's also isn't the same kind of money to be made in for instance, digital photography. I mean, digital cameras only were around for a fairly brief period of time, right? Like now everyone's using their cell phones, so it's like a completely different business. And it was really, that was really a hard transition to make for a company like Kodak, despite their international research lab. Because like the way I look at that history is partly by also bringing like another international research lab into the story in the mid 1980s, mid to late 1980s. Kodak also established a research lab in Japan, and the focus of that lab was really to look more into kind of digital imaging, and they collaborated with local camera producers, and so they invested a lot of resources in that project, but ultimately they weren't really able to turn that into like a successful, sustainable transition. Unfortunately, for like many of the people who suffered through this kind of dramatic decline of this industry.
Mhm. Well, Joris, thank you so much for sharing your project with us. It's just terrific, and I look forward to reading it when you're all done.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great talking with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, you're so welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.